The prairie had no mercy left in it. For weeks, the wind had been nothing but a cruel hand across her face, stripping the warmth from her skin and turning every breath into dust. The grass lay flat, beaten down by drought, and the sky, once wide and forgiving, seemed to shrink above her, pressing her closer to the ground with every mile. Her boots were splitting at the seams. The hem of her dress was torn, caked with mud, stiff with days of wear. But none of it weighed on her as heavily as the sound behind her. The slow, dragging steps of two small boys who had long since run out of strength. They had stopped asking for food 2 days ago. At first they had begged softly, pulling at her dress, their voices trembling with need. Then the begging had faded into whimpers, the whimpers into silence. Now they walked like shadows of themselves, heads bowed, eyes too old for their years, every step a battle. She had tried everything. She had bartered the last trinkets of her marriage, traded away the shawl her mother gave her, given the boys her share of whatever roots or scraps she could find along the roadside. Her body felt hollow, as though the hunger had eaten even the marrow from her bones. But she would not let them die, not while she still had breath left, and so when she saw the ranch rising against the horizon, her heart clenched so hard she thought it might break her ribs. It stood apart from the world, a line of fences biting into the land, a barn crouched, low beside a sprawling house of wood and stone. There was life here. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady and sure. Horses shifted in the corral, their tails swishing against the flies. The land around it was tilled, strong, and cared for, the kind of place that meant survival, but it was not the land that made her tremble. It was the man who owned it. Stories traveled faster than horses out on the prairie. She had heard them in whispers, passed from campfires to saloons, from wagon trains to markets. A man of towering frame, whose strength was as vast as the silence he carried. A man who spoke little, but whose eyes cut deeper than any blade. Some said he had lost his family long ago, and the grief had stolen his words. Others said he never had one to begin with, that the land itself had been his only kin. He was a giant, they said, and giants did not bend easily. Her steps faltered as the porch loomed closer. She thought of turning back, of finding some other miracle on the barren trail. But the boys tugged at her skirt, too weak to speak, and she knew there was no turning. Back and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She mounted the steps. The boards groaned under her weight, the sound loud in the stillness of the evening. The sky was bleeding gold into violet, shadows stretching long across the dirt. She raised her hand, hesitated, lowered it, then forced herself to knock. 1 knock. 2. The door opened slow, with the kind of creak that felt like a warning, and there he was. The man filled the doorway like a wall of stone, shoulders broad, arms heavy with the kind of strength forged by endless labor. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled to the elbows, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. His face was shadowed, rough with days of stubble, and his eyes were the kind that held storms without ever letting them loose. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her throat closed, words burning there like dry tinder. He looked at her, at the boys clinging to her dress, at the wear in her eyes. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why she had come. He simply stood, silent, waiting. Her lips trembled. Her chest ached as if the last pieces of her pride were cracking apart inside her ribs, and then the words spilled out, ragged, breaking, soaked in tears. "Take me, but feed my boys." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. She thought he might laugh, or shut the door, or walk away as though she had spoken to the wind. But the man did not move for a long while. His face remained unreadable, carved from the same silence that ruled the plains, and then, without a word, He stepped forward. One arm slid beneath her knees, the other braced her back, and suddenly she was lifted as though she weighed nothing at all. Her breath caught in her throat. Her boys gasped, clutching at each other, their eyes wide with fear and wonder. The giant rancher did not answer her plea with speech. He answered with action. Turning with steady steps, he carried her across the threshold of his home. His boots thudded heavy against the wooden floor. With one free hand, he gestured for the boys to follow. Their legs shook beneath them, but they obeyed, stepping into the glow of firelight. The door shut behind them. The air inside was warm, thick, with the faint smell of bread and wood smoke. For the first time in days, the boys' noses twitched, their eyes flicking to the table where food waited. And though she had offered herself in desperation, though she had spoken the words as a bargain, not a prayer, she realized in that moment that the silent man had already made his choice. He would feed them, and their lives had just changed forever. Morning light broke slowly over the plains, brushing gold across the rough wood of the ranch house. Every beam seemed to pause in the dust-filled air, settling softly on the floorboards, as if time itself were hesitant to move. The widow stirred from the thin blanket that had offered the boys so little warmth, but more comfort than they had known in months. Her eyes roamed across the room. The boys were curled together, their faces still pale but softer now, the hollows of starvation slowly filling with life. She held her breath, afraid to disturb the fragile peace, afraid that one wrong move might shatter this small miracle of safety. She rose carefully, every movement deliberate. She lit the fire, listening to the first crackle of wood and feeling a shiver of relief. Steam rose from the kettle as she filled it with water from the bucket outside. She set it to boil, her fingers trembling as she prepared the simplest breakfast: bread, beans, a touch of milk. These meager offerings felt like feasts, and yet she prepared them with the care of a queen arranging a banquet, for in her hands rested the fragile lives of her children. Outside, the rancher worked. His presence loomed, silent but commanding. He moved like part of the landscape itself, each motion measured, precise, and filled with a quiet authority. He repaired fences, tended the horses, carried water, everything performed without haste, but with purpose. The boys peeked from corners, both fascinated and fearful of this massive, silent figure. He did not speak to them, yet every action seemed to teach lessons of strength, patience, and respect. Time passed slowly, each hour drawn out like the slow turning of a clock hand. She fed the boys, encouraging them to eat with gentle words and soothing gestures. The youngest boy's small hands trembled around the cup of milk, yet he drank carefully, glancing up at the rancher as if seeking permission. Permission came not in words, but in the faintest nod the rancher allowed himself to give. That small motion carried more reassurance than any speech ever could. The widow observed him closely, noticing details that would have escaped any other. How his hands, scarred and calloused, moved gently across the horses' necks, brushing away dirt with the care of someone who had known hardship but not cruelty. How his eyes, sharp and watchful, seemed to see the world in a way that left nothing unattended, yet never intruded. How the tilt of his head, the subtle shift of weight, conveyed both awareness and patience. The boys grew bolder. They explored the house cautiously at first, discovering corners, examining objects long forgotten. A carved chair, a worn rug, a tin cup battered by time. They laughed quietly at first, the sound fragile, but persistent, as if testing whether the house could hold such joy. The widow smiled softly at the sounds, feeling her chest loosen after months of tension. Evenings brought new challenges. Shadows stretched long across the floor, carrying the weight of fear and memory. The widow sat by the fire, hands busy with mending clothes, dough, or small household tasks. The rancher's silence filled the room like a wall of safety. He moved methodically, placing firewood, checking doors, tending the smallest details, without needing to speak. Storms came. One night, wind tore across the plains, shaking the shutters violently. Thunder rolled like distant cannons. The youngest boy awoke screaming, his small body trembling. She rushed to him, holding him close, her own heart hammering. And then, as if summoned, the rancher entered. He knelt, resting a massive hand on the boy's back, steadying him without a word. The child pressed close, finally able to breathe without fear. The widow's tears fell silently. She realized that this man, imposing and silent, was teaching them safety, trust, and care without words. Days turned into weeks. Chores became rituals. Meals were prepared and eaten. The boys played in the yard, learning to ride, to care for the animals, to explore the land. Each small success was celebrated with smiles, laughter, and the quiet pride of survival. The widow joined them in subtle ways, learning strength she thought had been lost. She baked bread, tended the fire, and arranged small gardens, filling the house with smells, warmth, and life. By the third week, laughter became confident. The boys ran through the yard, chased one another across the porch, tumbled into hay piles with joy unrestrained. The widow observed quietly, savoring the sound that had been foreign to them for so long. The rancher allowed it. He watched, protected, and guided, never speaking unnecessarily, yet his presence shaped their days as if his silence itself were a lesson in strength and care. One afternoon, she dared to speak. "Why do you do this? You don't have to care for us like this," she said softly. He paused, placing a bucket down, then turned slowly. "Because it's right," he said quietly. No flourish, no explanation, just truth. That night, she sat by the fire, watching her boys sleep. She allowed herself a thought she had never dared. Perhaps life could be more than survival. Perhaps there was a place for them here, where hope existed in small gestures, laughter, and silent protection. Perhaps in this lonely, vast land they could belong. The ranch had begun to feel like a living organism. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the horses in the barn, each whisper of wind across the plains carried the rhythm of life. The widow and her boys had settled into a fragile yet growing sense of belonging. Yet each day reminded her how fragile this life still was, and how carefully it had to be tended. Mornings began long before the sun fully rose. The rancher would be outside, silhouetted against the faint glow of dawn, moving among the horses with a quiet precision that fascinated the boys. They followed him at a distance, silent observers, learning by imitation. Each task was a lesson: how to water the horses without startling them, how to mend a fence with patience, how to carry buckets of water without spilling a drop. Inside, the widow moved like a careful conductor of small symphonies. Breakfast had to be ready at the first light of day. Bread needed kneading, the fire tended, milk warmed, and eggs cooked just right. She found herself humming softly, a tune that had been lost to memory as she worked. The boys sat at the table, eating carefully, trying to match the rhythm of life that now seemed to surround them. The rancher's presence was constant, yet unobtrusive. He never demanded attention, never spoke unnecessarily, but he was always there, a pillar of strength, a silent guardian. The widow often caught him watching her and the boys from the doorway or through a window, his gaze steady and calm. It was not a gaze of judgment, but of quiet care, of someone ensuring that nothing went wrong in this small pocket of the world he had made theirs. Afternoons were filled with work and discovery. The boys explored the yard, chasing chickens, examining insects, learning the small wonders of the land. The eldest learned to ride a horse, clinging to the rancher's arm for balance, laughing in fear and exhilaration. The youngest practiced feeding the animals, imitating every motion he had observed, falling more than once but rising again with determination. The widow watched, marveling at their resilience. She noticed small changes, the way the boys' laughter had grown bolder, how their eyes had brighter color, how fear had given way to curiosity, and she noticed the rancher too, in subtle moments. How he adjusted a blanket for the boys, how he silently repaired a broken toy, how he ensured there was always water and food ready. His care was quiet, consistent, and profound. Evenings were the richest moments. After the chores were done, the family gathered by the fire. The boys would recount the day's discoveries, sometimes exaggerating in the innocence of childhood. She would smile, smoothing their hair, listening intently, laughing softly. The rancher would sit nearby, silent but watchful, occasionally allowing a small smile to break the stoic expression. It was a language of presence, a communication without words, teaching them that safety and love could exist even in silence. Storms came and went, each one a reminder of the wildness of the land. One particularly fierce night, wind tore through the ranch, rain beating against the roof in relentless rhythm. The boys clung to her, frightened. She whispered softly, stroking their hair, trying to calm them. The rancher entered the room as silent as a shadow, placing his massive hand on the boys' shoulders. They pressed against him instinctively, their small bodies anchored in his calm presence. He remained for a long moment, a living wall of protection, then stepped back silently as the storm continued its fury outside. Weeks became months. The rhythm of the ranch became their heartbeat. They learned the land, which plants were edible, how to read the weather in the clouds, which animals to avoid, which birds signaled rain. They learned the quiet strength of the rancher, the dignity in hard work, the importance of patience. And slowly, the widow learned too. Patience, courage, and the small joys that stitched together a life worth living. The boys grew stronger, braver. They explored further, ran faster, spoke louder. The youngest learned to ride on his own, wobbling and falling, but rising each time with giggles of triumph. The eldest helped him, learning leadership and compassion at the same time. The widow watched them, heart full, tears often slipping silently down her cheeks. The rancher remained a constant, enigmatic presence. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was measured and deliberate. One afternoon, after teaching the boys to herd the horses without fear, he turned to her, voice low and calm. "You're doing fine. They're doing fine." That simple acknowledgement carried more weight than 1,000 words. She felt a relief so profound it left her almost dizzy. It was confirmation that this life, messy, hard, uncertain, was becoming theirs. Small rituals became monumental. Baking bread in the morning, mending clothes together, walking across the yard to check fences, watching sunsets that turned the plains into a sea of gold. The boys grew confident. The widow grew strong. The rancher grew visible, not in words, not in declarations, but in presence, in actions, in the unspoken connection of shared life and survival. Evenings often ended with stories. The widow told them tales of faraway places, of hopes and dreams, sometimes laughing, sometimes with tears. The rancher would sit quietly nearby, listening, occasionally offering a rare comment, a faint chuckle, a nod. The boys adored him, though. They still called him the silent giant in whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. Life was far from easy. Chores never ended. Storms never ceased. Hunger had been replaced with toil, but toil was good. It was meaningful. And through every hardship, the silent rancher, the woman, and the boys learned the rhythm of survival, of trust, of a fragile but growing family. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in reds and golds, the house that had once been cold and unfamiliar now glowed with life, warmth, and laughter. The widow allowed herself a thought she had not dared in years. Perhaps they were not only surviving, perhaps they were finally living. And in that quiet, cinematic twilight, the rancher's presence spoke more loudly than words ever could. The plains stretched endlessly, golden under the afternoon sun, but the serenity was deceptive. Word had reached the ranch that outsiders, desperate, ruthless men, were traveling toward them, drawn by rumors of wealth, food, or perhaps vengeance. The widow and her boys felt a tension unlike anything they had known. The calm of the ranch was about to be tested. The rancher moved with quiet precision. His presence filled the yard like an invisible shield. The boys sensed the change. Their playful laughter replaced by whispers and wide-eyed glances. The widow held the youngest close, feeling the familiar fear tighten around her chest. She knew that the safety they had built could be threatened in an instant. Hours passed like minutes. Shadows lengthened across the porch. The wind carried faint sounds from the distance, hooves, voices, the subtle warning of approaching danger. The rancher, towering and calm, prepared. He moved silently, checking doors, securing gates, arranging tools that could serve as defenses. Each action was deliberate, measured, yet powerful. The children watched from the doorway, unsure whether to hide or help. The eldest boy, brave beyond his years, stepped forward. "Will they hurt us?" he asked, voice trembling. The rancher's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, massive and reassuring. No words, only presence. And in that silence the boy understood. They would be protected. As the intruders emerged on the horizon, a tense stillness blanketed the ranch. Dust swirled in the air, the afternoon sun casting long, dramatic shadows. The rancher moved first, guiding the boys to a safe corner, showing them subtle signs of where to stay, how to hide, how to remain unseen. The widow followed, heart racing, her hands clutching the youngest boy. When the men reached the fence, the rancher's figure emerged fully, a giant of calm authority. He did not shout. He did not brandish weapons unnecessarily. His presence alone was commanding, a silent challenge that spoke louder than any threat. The intruders hesitated, confused by the quiet confidence that radiated from this solitary man. A sudden movement, a horse kicked, a shout rang out, and then the storm of action began. The rancher moved with precision, intercepting the closest intruder, using strength and skill rather than anger. Every movement was calculated, a dance of survival and protection. The widow shielded the youngest boy, the eldest helping where he could, though terrified. Minutes stretched, a blur of motion, dust, and tension. The rancher's eyes never wavered. His every gesture was protective, guiding, controlling. He moved to intercept every threat, always calm, always silent in the midst of chaos. His power was terrifying yet controlled, a demonstration that violence could be both precise and purposeful when defending those you loved. The intruders began to falter, confused by the sheer calmness of their adversary. Every attempt to intimidate or attack was met with silent deflection, restraint, and authority. The widow watched, heart pounding, as the boys observed too, learning courage, the unspoken rules of survival, and the extraordinary power of trust. Finally, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the intruders retreated, bewildered, defeated not by words or fury, but by the quiet, unyielding presence of the rancher. The dust settled. The wind carried away the echoes of fear, leaving behind the fragile calm of victory. The widow sank to her knees, holding the youngest boy, tears flowing freely. She looked at the rancher, her heart overflowing with gratitude and awe. He said nothing, only nodded faintly, returning to his quiet vigilance. It was enough. more than enough. The boys approached him hesitantly, brushing dirt from their clothes. "Thank you," the eldest said softly. The rancher's hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their courage. The youngest clung to his mother, finally feeling safe again. Night fell over the plains, a calm darkness after the storm. Stars blinked into existence, the fire crackling in the hearth providing warmth and light. The widow prepared the meal, the boys eating with hunger and relief mingled. The rancher sat nearby, observing, ensuring everything was in order. No words were needed. The trust had been forged in action, in courage, in silent protection. As the firelight flickered across their faces, the widow dared to speak again. You saved us, all of us, and you never asked for anything in return." The rancher's eyes, steady and calm, met hers. For a long moment, silence passed, heavy with meaning. Then he simply said, "We take care of each other." The simplicity of the words, the weight behind them, struck her deeply. This man, silent giant, had become more than a protector. He was family. And in that moment she realized that the bond they shared was unbreakable, forged through trust, courage, and unspoken understanding. The boys, now laughing softly in the warmth of the fire, leaned against him. The youngest curled beside her, exhausted, but safe. And she finally allowed herself to breathe, truly breathe. After months of fear, hunger, and uncertainty, they were home. They were safe. They were family. The night stretched on, calm and eternal. Outside, the plains whispered under a gentle wind. Inside, the house glowed with warmth, life, and the quiet power of love and protection. And the giant rancher, silent but steadfast, watched over them all, a guardian whose presence spoke louder than words ever could. In the silence, in the shadows, in the calm after the storm, the widow realized one undeniable truth. In this harsh, unforgiving world, family was not only blood. Family was courage, protection, trust, and love. And they had found it here, in the quiet, enduring presence of the man who had carried them into safety. The fire burned long into the night, the boys asleep, the widow at peace, the rancher silent and vigilant. Tomorrow would bring chores, work, and perhaps new challenges. But for tonight there was only safety, only trust, only the quiet miracle of belonging. And in that calm, cinematic moment, as the plains stretched endlessly under the stars, the rancher's silent strength ensured that their lives, their hearts, and their hope would endure.